and probably signing my own death warrant by writing this account. I know for a fact that I'm breaking at least a dozen federal laws with penalties that could send me to prison for the rest of my life. But jail time is the least of my worries. I fully expect to get grabbed one of these days by a squad of government goons, a hood being placed over my head, before I'm put on a secret flight and transported to some godforsaken black site on the far side of the world. They'll make me disappear, toss me into a dark pit and leave me there to rot. You don't fuck with these people, not if you want to live. But none of this matters now. I've accepted my fate because the stories I need to tell are too important. The public must know the truth about the threats we face. This isn't easy to explain, but I'll do my best. For the past 2 years, I've worked within a top-secret government project, jointly financed by the Department of Defense and some of the wealthiest individuals and largest multinational corporations on the planet. What is our purpose? Well, perhaps you've heard of the multiverse theory. That is the idea of alternate universes which exist in parallel to our own. Well, our scientists have not only proved the existence of multiple universes, but have developed the technology to allow human beings to cross over and visit these alternate versions of Earth. I'm not going to give away many details of the technology we use to cross over, or the science behind it. I'm avoiding this area for 2 reasons. Firstly, I wish to protect my identity for as long as possible and therefore have no intention of revealing my precise role in the project. Don't get me wrong, I know the government will catch up with me eventually, but I want to keep them guessing for as long as possible, and I need to stay alive long enough to finish my story. Secondly, I don't want to drop any hints to America's enemies that would help them develop their own trans-dimensional portals. I know for a fact that China and Russia are working on their own TDPs, and they'll probably get there within the next couple of years. But the situation is fucked up enough already, and a multiverse race will only exacerbate the problem. However, it goes without saying that our portal technology took years to develop and cost many billions of dollars, not to mention the human cost and casualties. To be fair, the taxpayer hasn't fitted the entire bill, as a vast amount of money has been pumped in by the private sector. On paper, this is a scientific mission, but the reality is more complex. The political and business elites look at our world and fear for the future of humanity. With overpopulation, climate change, the threat of war, and global pandemics all in the mix, many experts believe our world is doomed and so are looking for an exit strategy. Terraforming Mars isn't considered feasible, nor is sending a generation ship to another star system. So, their plan is to find an alternate version of Earth that's less damaged and fucked up than our own and establish a seed colony upon it. Needless to say, this colony will be populated by the wealthy elite and their offspring, as they leave the rest of us to burn on this slowly dying planet. Pretty fucked up, right? But believe it or not, this isn't why I've decided to sacrifice myself by whistleblowing on this top secret project. What really gives me nightmares is what I've seen on the other side, the terrifying alternate worlds and the monsters which inhabit them. These evil and ruthless civilizations are technologically advanced and so surely capable of building their own TDPs now that we've unwittingly revealed that it's possible to travel across the multiverse. My worst fear is that these monsters will cross over to our world, unleashing hell and fury upon us. This brings me to the story of my first mission, our visit to Earth 217, a hellish dystopian world which I was lucky to survive. Before I get to this, however, it's worth explaining a bit more about the process of trans-dimensional travel. Again, I'm not going to reveal any technical details, but I can explain a few things. You might imagine a trans-dimensional portal as something like a whirlpool or a black hole. This is the way such portals are often portrayed on TV and in films. The reality is somewhat different, however. The best way I can describe the portal is a fluid membrane, a window to another reality. It's a controlled passageway which allows one to see what's on the other side, an image as clear as looking through a pane of thin glass. When you pass through the membrane, it's like immersing yourself in water. For a few seconds you can't breathe, and everything goes dark, and for a terrifying moment your brain panics as you think you won't make it. But then you pass through to the other side, taking a deep breath of clean air, and never having felt so relieved to be alive. Needless to say, it takes an astronomical amount of energy to open a portal and to keep the field stable long enough for a team to cross over safely. The money and power that goes into this means it's only possible to keep a portal open for 2 minutes, and the passageway is only wide enough for 2 men to cross over, walking shoulder to shoulder. Therefore, we can only deploy small teams with the bare minimum of equipment. We can't bring whole vehicles through, so we need to rely on quad bikes and motorcycles, and we use small, short to medium range drones for reconnaissance. The initial crossing is a tight and well-organized procedure, but the return trip is often frantic and chaotic. The survey teams aren't able to open a TDP from their end. This must be done from the research facility back on our Earth. The timeline is tightly coordinated, with the portal being reopened exactly 24 hours after the initial crossing. Any members of the team who don't make it back to the rendezvous point in time are going to be stuck on the other side indefinitely, and will need to deal with whatever threats they encounter without assistance. Now, the return shouldn't be a problem if the team has a clear run on the other side, but if they've run into trouble ... well, that's a different story. It's worth pointing out that the majority of the worlds we've discovered and visited aren't so different from our own. There might be a few historical divergences, but basically you have societies not dissimilar to Earth 1. These worlds are written off as unviable. However, they have the same problems as us: overpopulation, pollution, the threats of an extinction-level event, and so on. Basically, they're not what our wealthy benefactors are looking for, as they aren't suitable for colonization. Nevertheless, the trips over to these worlds are generally straightforward and risk-free. It's the minority of missions that prove problematic. Now, it goes without saying that we don't send men and women across until we check out the conditions on the other side. As a first step, we send across a robot similar to the Mars rover, designed to test soil samples and oxygen levels, checking the atmosphere for toxins and background radiation. The latter could indicate that a nuclear war has occurred at some point in the planet's recent history. On 2 occasions, the probes haven't returned. One time, the robot emerged in the stratosphere, floating aimlessly through space before the communication feed cut out. Our theory is that, in this universe, the Earth itself had been destroyed and broken up into debris. On another mission, the robot discovered a dead planet without any signs of life, and no evidence that it had ever existed. The temperature was so high that the robot burned up within a minute, and the mission was abandoned. Most times, however, the probe will send back its data for analysis, and our people will assess that it's safe to send in a survey team. Things become interesting when we discover a world very different to our own. The most viable world we've visited is one where Homo sapiens went extinct before the last ice age, and instead Neanderthals have evolved to become the dominant species. However, this Neanderthal civilization hasn't developed at the same rate as ours. They never reached the Industrial Revolution, and are instead living in a medieval world, a primitive, agrarian society with a relatively small global population. This version of Earth is actually considered the most viable for colonization by the folk running our operation. However, there is a moral debate within the project's leadership, as it's widely accepted that any human colony will likely result in the genocide of the native Neanderthal population. I suspect this argument won't hold sway in the long run. Millions of natives were wiped out during the colonization of the Americas after all. But of course, this all depends on us surviving long enough to make this happen, which brings me back to my first story, the mission to Earth 217. It's difficult to describe my emotions on that morning, as I stood in line with my pack and equipment strapped to my back, dressed in combat fatigues and full body armor. I'd been through extensive training and preparation prior to this, my first mission and first time entering a TDP, but nothing fully prepares you. I stood on the metal gangway along with 8 other men and women, each ready to push forward either a box full of equipment or a bike, all fixed up to a rail to allow quick access to the TDP. The portal wasn't open yet, but we knew we'd need to move quickly whenever it did, and the entire team had worked together through training to ensure we could complete our crossing within the tight 2-minute window. Our team leader stood at the bottom of the gangway, close to the vast array of powerful equipment which would be used to open the TDP in just a few short minutes. I'm not going to name the man, nor will I identify anyone involved in the project. Instead, I will use aliases. Many of these people are still alive and working on the project. Others have died, often under horrific circumstances during missions. Their families have been told fake accounts of how their loved ones died, and given the terrible truth, I believe it's better they continue to believe these lies. Sometimes the truth is too hard. Our team leader on that mission was an ex-military officer, and for the purposes of this account I'll refer to him as Custer. I'll never forget the way Custer looked that morning, and the words he spoke in the last moments before our crossing. The well-built, battle-hardened veteran seemed to exert total confidence as he shouted to be heard over the increasing volume of equipment and machinery coming to life.
Listen up, ladies and gents.
He bellowed.
Some of you are making this crossing for the first time. Others have walked through the portal before. Frankly, it makes no difference. I'm a veteran of a dozen missions, and let me tell you, no two journeys are the same. The probes only tell us so much, and there's no way of knowing what we'll encounter on the other side. It's an unknown environment, and we must be prepared for anything. Some of you are ex-military, others are experts in your individual fields. Geologists, climatologists, anthropologists, tech, and communications. You're all vital members of the team, but never forget that this is a team, and I am your leader. Military or not, when we're in the field, my word is final. Remember your training, listen to my orders, and you'll get home safely. Now, am I making myself clear?
Yes, sir.
We answered in unison, the ex-military personnel doing so rather more enthusiastically than us civilians. Other than Custer, there were 3 other members of the security team, Mitch, Jerry, and Kaz. All were heavily armed and appeared focused and deadly serious. If they were as scared as me, they were doing a good job hiding it. The rest of the team was made up by our medic, who I'll call Doc, our tech guys Phil and Juan, and our team geologist Helen. It was a damn good team, and we'd spent weeks in intense training in preparation for this mission, forming a close bond with each other in the process. I can't help but feel a terrible sadness when I think back to that time, given what happened. But at that moment, we were still a team, pumped up with adrenaline and ready to undertake our mission. My legs were shaking as the spectrometer burst to life, the power surging through the conductors as the initializing process commenced. My brain was racing as I imagined all the things that could go wrong. Would today be the day that the stabilizing field failed and the whole facility was blown to kingdom come? Or perhaps the entire team would fall into limbo, lost in the nothingness between the 2 universes. But I had to put these fears to the back of my mind, as there was simply no time for hesitation or doubt. Suddenly there was a burst of blinding light, followed by a wave of intense heat which almost knocked me off my feet. When I opened my eyes, I saw it. The trans-dimensional portal, a window to another world, suddenly opened against the back wall of the bunker. I stood there awestruck for a moment, staring at the incredible scene before me. Perhaps part of me still hadn't believed a TDP was possible, and my brain couldn't come to terms with it. But I was soon awoken from my trance by Custer's barked orders.
Move, goddammit! Get the equipment through! The clock is ticking!
I remembered my training as I shoved the metal container boxes down the rail, physically exerting myself as I worked with my team members. 2 minutes, that's all we had. I didn't think we'd make it, but Custer knew what he was doing. Container boxes and vehicles went down the rail and through the portal, followed by people, human beings disappearing into a fluid membrane, temporarily ceasing to exist in any universe until they suddenly emerged in an alternate reality. I hesitated for a brief second before it was my turn to cross, only to feel a firm hand on my back, physically pushing me forward. I literally fell through the membrane, my brain racing in panic as all the air left my lungs. For a terrifying moment, I knew nothing but darkness, a non-existence that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. But, thank God, it only lasted for a moment. My limp body spilled out on the other side of the portal, hitting the ground hard as the bile rose up my throat and I vomited all over the grass. My head throbbed and my whole body shook as I struggled to breathe, and I adjusted my eyes to my new environment. A moment later, someone pulled me up to my feet, and I was amazed that I could stand without support. I glanced back just in time to see the portal vanish into thin air. It was too late to turn back. We were over here in this alternate universe, and entirely reliant on our colleagues back on Earth 1 to bring us home. If anything went wrong over there, we'd be trapped here forever. A terrifying prospect, but I couldn't think about it at that moment. I needed to focus on the mission.
Welcome to Earth 217, ladies and gents!
Custer boomed. People around me were already jumping into action, our security people setting up a defensive perimeter, while our tech guys recovered and set up their equipment, checking that nothing had been damaged during our crossing. I examined my surroundings, finding myself standing on top of a small grassy hill. The sky above was blue, with only a few specks of white cloud to be seen. All this was a good sign, as was the fact that I was breathing clean air.
Not bad, huh?
I turned around to see Helen, our team's geologist, an attractive and intelligent woman in her late 20s. Helen was one of my closest friends during our training. I agreed without committing too much.
Could be our Goldilocks world.
Helen added.
But we still have tests to run.
Air quality is all good, said Juan, one of our tech guys, as he typed into his laptop. Let's get the transmitter set up, then we'll send the drone for a spin. There are a couple of things I should clarify about our insertion point before I continue this account. Our research facility was purpose-built for this project, and intentionally located in an isolated and sparsely populated corner of the continental US. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to reveal the location, but suffice to say it's pretty much in the middle of nowhere. When we cross over, the team will arrive at the exact same location on the alternate version of Earth, and the theory is that there will be nothing much located on the other side of the portal, allowing us to get in and out without drawing attention. Usually it works out that way, but not always. We use small, remotely controlled drones to survey the surrounding area, most of which is empty countryside. However, on our Earth there is a small town located about 10 kilometers from the insertion site, and often the town will also exist in the alternate worlds we visit, although not always in the manner we'd expect. However, another and safer way of finding out about the civilization is simply to set up a transmitter and receive any indigenous radio signals or television broadcasts in the vicinity. We've learned almost everything we need to know about numerous alternate worlds by using this simple method. For the next few hours we got to work, patrolling the perimeter, taking soil samples, and collating and analyzing data. The initial survey didn't bring up much concern. If anything, the air was cleaner and less polluted than back home. My job, for what it's worth, was to analyze the drone footage and broadcasts to make an assessment on what type of civilization we were dealing with. And what I found did raise a few red flags. We sat down after lunch to provide our intelligence briefing to Custer, sitting cross-legged in a circle as our leader stood over us. I'll confess that I found his stern gaze and authoritative voice rather intimidating, especially in this alien and unknown world.
What have you got for me?
He asked, or rather demanded. I gulped before replying. Well, sir, the drone has brought back footage of the surrounding area, and we found no signs of life. The town exists in this world, but it appears to be uninhabited, and the evidence suggests it's been so for quite some time. The buildings are crumbling, and whatever vehicles we can see are rusted wrecks. Most of the roads in the area are nothing more than dirt tracks. The road to the north looks like it's been paved in the recent past, but clearly it's not a busy throughway. We've not seen any human beings, although that's not to say there's nobody around.
What about the airwaves?
Custer interjected impatiently. Well, that's been more difficult to interpret. I replied sheepishly, realizing from Custer's hard glare that he'd surely want more. What we've heard and seen can largely be regarded as propaganda. Military parades, political rallies, government-sanctioned information broadcasts. Not much in the way of cultural diversity.
So, what does this mean?
Custer interrupted. Clearly, he was losing his patience. I nervously shrugged my shoulders before answering. I can't fully commit myself without additional data, but my guess would be some kind of dictatorship or totalitarian regime? Great. Goddamn commie world, quipped Phil, one of our technicians. His joke earned him a few sniggers from the assembled team members, but a hard glare and harsh words from our leader.
Shut your damn mouth!
Custer shot back. The former military officer stood still for a moment, staring off into the distance as he engaged in quiet contemplation. After a tense delay, he opened his mouth to speak, delivering his orders concisely and with confidence.
We're going in!
He commanded. I temporarily forgot myself, calling him out in shock. Are you sure about that, sir? What about the protocol?
I'm the leader over here, and what I say goes.
Custer shot back angrily.
We must gather more data. Isn't that what you said?
I nodded my head in reluctant agreement.
Well, so it's settled. We'll take a 4-man team down to the old town, see if it's really as abandoned as it looks. I'll lead the team.
He pointed directly at me.
You'll ride with me. Kaz and the doc will be our backup. We move out in 10. Get your shit together, people.
I experienced a moment of intense dread in that moment. I didn't want to go on this mission, but knew I had no choice. But of course, I had no idea of what lay ahead. It was almost dusk by the time we reached the seemingly abandoned town. We drove to the location on 2 quad bikes, doubled up. I rode with Custer, while Kaz and the doc had the second bike. Kaz was a tough ex-Marine in her mid-30s, a strong woman who'd spent her life needing to prove herself in a male-dominated environment. The doc was our team's medical attendant. He was an odd man with peculiar obsessions. As I recall, he'd never really bonded with the rest of the team during our training, and we all regarded him with a degree of suspicion. I got the distinct feeling that Kaz wasn't happy about riding alongside the doc, but she didn't question her orders. To this day, I still don't know why Custer ordered the reconnaissance mission, especially given the risks and unknowns involved. I can only assume he was acting on orders from higher up. The town itself could be described as anywhere USA, small, out of the way, and unremarkable. When we descended from the hills and drove through the main street, we confirmed what the drone footage had already told us. This was a ghost town of crumbling buildings, smashed storefronts with faded signs, and rusty old automobiles which looked like throwbacks from the 1950s. Obviously, the settlement had been abandoned decades ago. But why? There were no toxins in the air, no background radiation. It was as if the entire population had just upped and left one day for no apparent reason. At first glance, there were no signs of life. Nevertheless, I felt incredibly uneasy as we drove down that debris-strewn main street. The hairs stood up on the back of my neck as I got the distinct feeling we were being watched. Suddenly, I saw a flurry of movement out of the corner of my eye, turning to see a dark figure disappearing behind the smashed-up wreck of a truck. "Did you see that?" I whispered in a panic.
Keep calm.
Custer answered in an authoritative tone. He put his foot down on the accelerator, but a few yards down the road we hit an invisible wall, as all of our tires were pierced simultaneously, bringing our quad bike to a sudden halt.
Fuck!
Custer swore.
They've spiked the road.
In an instant, he jumped off the bike and pulled his assault rifle from his shoulder, and a moment later he dragged me from my pillion seat, pulling me down to the ground as we took cover behind the now immobile quad bike. Custer shouted back to the second bike, which was yet to hit the spike trap.
Stop! Ambush! Get down!
Kaz responded in an instant, bringing her vehicle to a halt before descending with her rifle at the ready. The doc kept his head up, scanning the horizon with curiosity until Kaz pulled him back. I peeked over the top of our vehicle and saw the street suddenly come to life as armed figures emerged on rooftops and shattered windows, aiming their guns straight at us. I don't know how our drone had missed this armed group during its run, but obviously they'd remained hidden in order to mount an ambush. In a panic, I scanned the street and counted at least a dozen armed men and women surrounding us on all sides. There were only 4 of us, and only Custer and Kaz were armed. I know little about combat, but it seemed obvious to me that we wouldn't stand a chance if it came to a shootout. A tension-filled standoff ensued before a voice from the other side broke the silence.
"We've got you outgunned and surrounded. You don't have a chance. Put your guns down and come out with your hands up."
I couldn't see the man speaking, but it sounded like he meant business. Judging by his response, Custer clearly agreed.
Fuck!
He swore under his breath before calling out his response.
Okay, we're putting our guns down. Don't shoot us. We mean you no harm.
"We'll see about that,"
answered the suspicious voice from the other side. Custer carefully lay his assault rifle down on the ground before he slowly stood up, his hands raised above his head. I copied his actions, as did Kaz and the doc. My whole body shook as I struggled to stand. I couldn't believe we'd stumbled into this deadly situation, and feared what these people would do to us.
Just let me do the talking.
Custer whispered in my ear. I felt angry, knowing our team leader had gotten us into this mess. I had no idea what Custer was going to say to our captors. How could he possibly explain our presence here? Gradually, the ambush party emerged from their hiding places, approaching us with caution and with their guns still raised. I watched our captors under the fading light and was surprised by their appearance. The 12 included men, women, and even children. They were of various ages and different races, but all appeared disheveled and malnourished, their eyes tired and hungry and their faces filled with desperation. All were thin to the point of being emaciated and wore ripped and soiled clothing. I'm no expert on firearms, but their guns looked ancient and obsolete, a combination of World War II-era rifles and civilian shotguns. All in all, they looked like the kind of ragged armed survivors you'd expect to find in a dystopian wasteland. One of our captors stepped forward, slinging a grease gun over his shoulder as he came. He was a black man with a noticeable scar across his face and a hardened look in his eye. He seemed like a man who'd been to hell and by the way he carried himself, I guessed he was the leader of this ragged band.
Wise decision.
He said, with a slight grin on his dry lips. I recognized his voice, realizing he was the one who'd called for our surrender moments before. Custer opened his mouth to reply, but he never got the chance. At that moment, everybody's attention was drawn to the rooftops overlooking the street. I heard a low animalistic growl, which chilled me to my bones, looking up to see what I can only describe as a living nightmare. The creature was half man, half wolf, its snout packed with razor-sharp teeth and its eyes filled with intense hatred. I looked on in awestruck terror as the beast stood up on 2 feet, revealing claws as sharp as steak knives, and then it opened its horrible maw, unleashing a god-awful howl that drowned out every other sound. The armed men seemed frozen in fear for a second, until their leader prompted them to take action, screaming,
Kill it!
Suddenly, the air was filled with bullets, the din of gunfire almost deafening. The beast should have been hit, but it moved so fast, leaping from the rooftop and pouncing on the nearest rebel, ripping his throat out in a mere second, and spilling his blood all across the street. Somebody screamed before the gunfire commenced once again, but the beast seemed immune to the bullets as it tore down the street, hitting one rebel after another, tearing them to shreds with its teeth and claws before they could react. I heard the blood-curdling screams, and saw the blur of bloody violence as bodies were ripped apart and viscera was splattered all over the tarmac. Custer shook me out of my shock-induced trance, grabbing me and screaming,
Get behind me!
He picked up his M4 carbine and made it ready to fire. No one from the other side tried to stop him. They were too busy dying. By now, the beast was ripping the head off its 6th victim. Custer advanced upon it, firing on full automatic as he moved. At least one of his bullets hit the mark, causing the monster to howl in pain, but the round didn't even slow it down. Suddenly, the beast turned its attention to Custer, who was desperately trying to load a new magazine into his M4. The beast jumped him before he had the chance, slashing Custer's chest with its claws. Custer screamed as he fell backwards, and the beast bit deep into its victim's shoulder. I was sure he was done for, but just then, the gunfire started back up again as a burst of rounds struck the monster and forced it back, releasing its deadly grip upon Custer. I looked up to see Kaz advancing, firing short bursts from her M4. The beast was hit again and again, but the bastard wouldn't die. Kaz didn't miss a beat, however. She kept pumping bullets into her target's body until her magazine was empty. And then she dropped her rifle and drew her sidearm, a 9mm Glock. She kept on shooting without mercy, ignoring the creature's whimpered cries and her determination to end its life. Finally, she stood over its limp body and emptied the last 5 bullets straight into its head. This coup de grace seemed to do the trick, as finally the beast stopped moving, its life force extinguished. Slowly, the survivors emerged from their hiding places to survey the carnage left behind after the savage attack, a lightning assault and battle that had lasted less than 2 minutes. Kaz and I ran to Custer's side, quickly establishing that he was still alive despite his horrific injuries. I looked on in horror at the deep wounds to his chest and shoulder. He'd lost a lot of blood and clearly was in considerable pain, groaning in agony as he struggled with every breath. Kaz placed pressure on his shoulder wound to stem the bleeding as she called out,
Doc, where the hell are you? We need your help.
I scanned the blood-strewn street for our medical man, finding him leaning over the body of the wolfman, poking at its ribs as if he were conducting a post-mortem.
Fascinating. The exoskeleton on this animal is unlike anything that occurs in nature. It's almost as if someone has set out to design the perfect killing machine.
I needed to place a firm hand on Doc's shoulder to bring him back to reality.
God damn it, Doc! Custer is hurt bad. You need to see him.
I exclaimed angrily.
Yes, of course. Let's see what we can do for him.
The doctor appeared rather annoyed and taken aback, but he complied. He leaned down beside the wounded officer, shaking his head and tutting as he opened his medical bag.
He's in a bad way,
the doc said, as if stating the obvious.
I can bandage up his wounds and give him something for the pain, but most of my supplies are back at the camp. I'll need to get him back there and stabilize him. Otherwise, he'll never survive the journey home.
Kaz nodded grimly. With Custer incapacitated, she'd taken on the role of team leader, and no one was questioning her.
Okay,
she said.
The tires are out on the lead quad bike. The doc needs to take Custer back on the second bike, which means we'll need to stay here.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
So we're stuck in this hellhole? I exclaimed in dismay.
Calm down.
Kaz replied.
I'll radio back to base. Get Mitch and Jerry to ride down here on the motorbikes and pick us up. If we ride pillion, we'll get back by sundown, in time for the rendezvous. It's cutting it fine, but we'll make it.
I was far from convinced. None of this was part of the original plan, and there were about 1,000,000 things which could go wrong. I knew how tight our window was, and if we were even 5 minutes late arriving back, we'd be trapped here forever. But this wasn't even my biggest concern at that moment. I was far more worried about how we'd survive the night.
And just what the hell do we do if another one of those monsters show up?
I asked, pointing to the bullet-ridden body of the wolfman.
Then we deal with it.
Kaz shot back angrily.
Now, help me with Custer.
We gently lifted our leader's broken body and got him onto the back of the quad bike. I watched as the doctor drove the bike out of the ghost town and back into the hills. At the time, I honestly believed we'd signed our death warrants, but I couldn't deny that Kaz had made the right call. While Kaz radioed back to base, I turned my attention to the surviving rebels, watching as they tended to their fallen comrades. Some said tearful prayers over the shredded remains, while others recovered their weapons, ammunition, and anything else they had on their person, including food, tobacco, and various other trinkets and personal effects, as meager as they were. In all, 6 of the dozen rebels had been slaughtered in the beast's lightning assault, half of their number killed in just under 2 minutes.
I guess we should be thanking you people.
I turned around to see the rebel's leader approaching, his weapon shouldered as he extended his hand in friendship. Only moments before he'd been holding us at gunpoint, but things had changed very quickly. I took his hand and shook.
Wyatt's my name, and these are my people. Well, what's left of them?
I introduced myself and expressed my sorrow for his losses. Then I nodded to the dead beast laid out on the roadside.
So, what the hell is that thing?
I asked incredulously. Wyatt seemed puzzled by the very question.
It looks like a goddamn werewolf.
I quipped, only half joking. Wyatt confirmed with a shrug.
Sure. But this one's a rogue. A hunting dog which got away from the Aryans. Now they roam the countryside, killing everything that moves.
Alarm bells started ringing inside of my head.
Hold up. Aryans? You mean like Nazis?
Wyatt appeared even more puzzled.
Nazis? Yeah, they started off that way, back during the final war. There's something far worse now, but how can you not know this?
I felt a twinge of panic, realizing I'd given away too much.
We're not from around here,
I answered meekly.
Well, that much is obvious,
said Wyatt.
You aren't Aryans, that's obvious too, but the guns, equipment, and vehicles you have are far better than anything we've got. You might be from another district, but the Aryans rule the whole world. Hell, they even have bases on the moon and colonies on Mars.
I saw Kaz had finished her call and was now listening in on our conversation, shooting me a reproachful look as a warning not to say too much. But I didn't see any way of explaining this to Wyatt, nor did I see any advantage in keeping secrets from him. I took a deep breath before answering.
Look, we came from another world. Or more accurately, another version of this one. Our scientists have worked out a way of crossing from our dimension to the next, and so here we are.
I expected Wyatt to laugh in my face, but he didn't. Certainly, the rebel boss appeared shocked by my admission, but he didn't dismiss my explanation out of hand. I guess when you live in a world run by Nazis and overrun by werewolves, it's going to take a lot to faze you. We're Americans. Those words seemed to bring Wyatt some comfort, to know that his country still existed in some alternate version of Earth. Kaz interjected at this point.
Who are you people anyway? The American Resistance.
Wyatt shook his head, and I saw the sorrow in his eyes before he began his sorrowful explanation.
We used to be, many decades ago. America stayed out of the war in Europe during the 40s, and when the Nazis eventually conquered us, they allied with people who looked like them and brutalized the rest. The same thing happened all across the world. Nations conquered, and populations trampled under their damn jackboots. They enslaved some and slaughtered the rest, first by firing squads, then by gas chambers and mass starvation, and finally by releasing viruses designed to kill non-Aryans. Millions wiped out, whole continents emptied. Now the Nazis' descendants live in fortified plantations and citadels. They've used their evil science to create their damned master race. And worse.
He pointed to the dead werewolf.
Monsters like this, they're the result of their twisted experiments. Intelligent and super-strong predators, trained to be obedient to their masters.
He raised his voice, and the anger and pain were evident in his words.
And us? We're not the resistance anymore. We're goddamn prey. They hunt us down for sport, slaughter us like cattle. All us folk can do now is try to survive. We hide, move from place to place, and fight back when we can. But we're dying out. Year after year, our numbers grow smaller.
He sighed and lowered his head, tears welling up in his eyes as his surviving comrades gathered around him. His story was horrifying, but I had no doubt he was telling the truth. This world was a place of living nightmares, one of Nazi super soldiers, genetically modified werewolves, and human hunting. I'd never imagined I would visit such a terrible place, but here we were, right in the middle of this shit. I was still trying to come to terms with what Wyatt had told us when Kaz brought the conversation back to business.
What will your people do now?
She asked.
It's too dangerous to travel on foot after dark.
Wyatt replied.
We'll need to hold up here until dawn.
He pointed down the street.
There's an old church down there. Not much, but it still has 4 walls and a roof. We'll take shelter there tonight. I'd suggest you come with us. It's the safest place to wait for your rescue team.
I felt a cold chill as we walked down the tarmac. Somehow, I knew we were in for a hellish night. The old church was predictably a wreck, but as Wyatt had promised, it still had 4 walls and a roof, which made the place more habitable than most in the ghost town. Wyatt and his team went to work as soon as we took up residence, using discarded pews and various debris to barricade the doors and windows. Clearly, they expected a further attack during the night, whether by Nazis, werewolves, or whatever the hell else was out there. We'd barely survived the last attack, and so I dreaded imagining what would happen next. Kaz helped to organize the rebels' defenses, taking charge and adapting to the situation with typical military efficiency. I could do nothing but admire her courage and resilience. Kaz knew all too well that I was no fighter, so she gave me her Glock pistol and ordered me to stay at the back. She gifted Custer's M4 to Wyatt and gave him a quick tutorial on its use. The rebel leader looked as pleased as Punch with the upgrade. After the defensive preparations were made, there was little to do but wait. I engaged Wyatt and his people in conversation in an attempt to find out more about their world's society and tragic history, but they were understandably distracted and perhaps unable to answer my questions. It was a terrifying time as we sat in the ruined church staring out into the darkness, waiting on whatever nightmares might emerge to devour us. I did wonder why I'd ever gotten involved in this operation. What madness had driven me to come to this hellscape? Perhaps Cass shared my regrets, but if so, she showed no signs, remaining cool and focused throughout. I can't describe the relief I experienced whenever I heard the whine of the motorcycle engines, followed by the burst of communication from Kaz's radio. I eagerly glanced out the window and saw the 2 security men riding in on their bikes. Our rescuers had finally arrived. My elation faded when I looked to the tired and desperate faces of Wyatt and his people, realizing we would be leaving them behind. But as it happened, fate intervened. As Mitch and Jerry pulled up in front of the church, a 3rd vehicle drove in from the opposite direction, its heavy diesel engine drowning out the sound of the motorcycles. I looked on in horror as a grotesque Jeep-like vehicle tore down the street, its powerful headlights illuminating the tarmac. The large automobile was heavily armored and bristling with weapons, and something much worse, 3 human skulls mounted to the hood in a horrific display.
Fuck!
Wyatt swore as he came up behind me.
It's Steiner and his hunting party. They found us.
I looked into the man's hard eyes and saw his fear for the first time. Terrified, I turned back to the window and saw 3 figures emerging from the Jeep and moving with speed, muscular and athletic men in dark body armor and carrying alien but deadly-looking assault rifles. And from the rear of the vehicle leapt not 1 but 2 of those hellhounds, vicious werewolves as ferocious as the feral we'd previously encountered. Except these 2 were clearly trained and under the control of the Aryan hunters, obeying their every command. Mitch and Jerry were out in the open, apparently unaware of the immense danger they were in, at least until Cass shouted them a 1-word warning.
Run!
The gunfire started a second later as the Nazi hunters opened up with their rifles. Mitch and Jerry ran for it while laying down covering fire. They couldn't make it to the church in time, so they took cover in a disused gas station across the street. The soldiers made it by the skin of their teeth as bullets flew and hunting dogs snarled. By then, all hell was breaking loose as the rebels opened up and the Aryan Death Squad began their assault. Just then, Kaz grabbed me by the shoulders and forced me away from the window.
Stay down and keep out of the way. Shit!
She screamed at me before taking up her firing position and joining the battle. I did as I was told, taking cover behind the pews and laying low as the gun battle raged in all its fury. As I cowered in the corner, I missed much of the anarchy which followed, but I did witness the bloody results. 3 of the rebels fell in quick succession. A man's head was blown off not 10 yards from me. A woman was cut down by a burst of automatic fire, and a kid who could only have been 14 or 15 got hit by shrapnel from a grenade. The carnage was horrific, and I feared we were about to be overrun, but Wyatt and Cass continued to fight back fiercely, moving from window to window whilst laying down suppressing fire. Suddenly, there was a pause in the firing, and for a brief second I dared to think the battle was over, but then a single shot rang out, striking Wyatt in his shoulder, the impact throwing his body backwards. Cass swore as she abandoned her position and sprinted towards the barricaded door. A moment later, there was a mighty explosion which rocked the entire structure. The room filled with dust and my ears were ringing. I looked up and was horrified to see the barricade breached. A figure emerged from the chaos, moving with immense speed as he shot a rebel through the head and tore across the floor. Kaz tried to stop him, but he floored her with a blow to the face. A second later, a ferocious werewolf tore into the church after its master, slashing a rebel to shreds with its mighty claws before he could get off a shot. Suddenly, I realized there was nothing, and no one standing between me and the beast, and I would need to defend myself. Raising my pistol with a shaking hand, I managed to fire a single shot, missing my target. The beast was so fast, and I never got a chance for a second attempt. In an instant it was on top of me, knocking me to the hard ground and pinning me down, its sharp claws cutting into my chest. Its maw was only inches from my face, its foul breath making me retch as its teeth snapped. I was certain I would die there. And then my head ripped off by the beast's mighty jaws. But clearly its master wasn't done with me yet. I heard a loud, high-pitched whistle and suddenly the beast released me, retreating to his master's feet. I struggled to breathe, hardly believing I was still alive. I looked for my pistol, but found it had been thrown clear, out of my reach. I couldn't stand in any case. Helpless and defeated, I glanced at the jackboots of my assailant, scanning upwards to see the muscular body in black combat fatigues and the large weapon aimed at my head. I noted the death's head emblem on his uniform, surely a throwback to his Nazi ancestors. Blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and with chiseled Nordic features, but he glared down upon me like a predator would look upon its prey, casting a cruel and sadistic gaze which showed no hint of compassion or capacity for mercy. When he spoke it was in English, but his accent was vaguely European.
"You people killed 2 of my men,"
he said in an accusatory tone. I struggled to reply through my quaking lips, stuttering my words. But the Nazi surprised me by merely shrugging his shoulders and laughing.
"No matter. Those boys were weak. The truth is, our race has become soft. It's good to have some worthy adversaries after all these years. Although, evidently, you are no warrior."
He paused, looking me over with contempt as I lay helpless before him. I spluttered, unable to find the words to respond. The Nazi grunted in disgust.
"Cat got your tongue? Well, let me introduce myself. I am Commander Steiner, Lead Hunter General of District 23, North America. And you are an intruder in my district. Evidently, you're not one of these wretched bandits. Your equipment and weapons are too sophisticated. So, who in Hitler's name are you?" I kept my mouth shut, knowing all too well the consequences of revealing the truth to this monster. Steiner looked amused by my pitiful show of resistance. "Fine. It will be enjoyable forcing the truth from you. I consider myself something of an expert on torture techniques, and I'm always keen to find new subjects for my work." Steiner grinned sadistically as he shouldered his rifle and drew a sharp and long dagger.
I shuddered in terror at the sight of the blade, wanting to run but knowing I wouldn't make it far. Steiner's werewolf never took its eyes off me, its fangs dripping with blood and its eyes filled with hatred. Steiner advanced upon me, his eyes focused and his knife at the ready. In my panicked state, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a scream of fury from a voice I recognized. To my astonishment, I saw a wounded Wyatt charging across the floor, screaming like a berserker as he came. I looked to his hand and saw the deadly device he carried, a grenade with its pin pulled. The werewolf reacted fast to defend its master, but not quickly enough. The beast hit Wyatt, knocking him down, but the grenade detonated a second later, blowing them both to Kingdom Come. The explosion was so close I was deafened by it, as the blood and guts of the man and beast sprayed all over me in a sickening display. Somehow, I forced myself to my feet, surveying the carnage and gore before me. Wyatt had sacrificed his life to save me, and I could never thank him. I searched for Steiner, and saw his motionless and bleeding body laid out on the floor. I struggled through body parts, still in a daze when I spotted a figure approaching at speed. To my relief, I saw it was Kaz, badly bruised but on her feet and still fighting. She grabbed me firmly, shaking me out of my stunned daze. A moment later, we were running out of the church and back onto the street. I looked to the old gas station and saw what remained of Mitch and Jerry, the security men who were meant to rescue us. Jerry lay sprawled across the street, his head almost severed from his neck. Meanwhile, Mitch sat leaning against a wall, his head slumped and his guts torn out, the M4 laying by his side. A dead werewolf, riddled with bullets, lay about 6 yards from him. Evidently, the two men had died fighting the beast. I spared a thought for my fallen comrades before being interrupted. Just then, the hunter's grotesque jeep pulled up alongside me, with Kaz in the driver's seat.
You can't be serious. You want to ride in that thing?
I exclaimed in disbelief.
You got a better idea?
Kaz shot back angrily.
We need to get back to camp before sunrise, unless you want to become a permanent resident.
She was right again, of course, and so I jumped into the passenger seat of the Nazi death mobile and we sped out of the ghost town, leaving the death and carnage behind us. We raced up the hillside at I don't know what speed, tensely watching the clock all the way, and we arrived back at the camp with literally minutes to spare, just as the morning sun was rising over the hills. Helen and the others looked on in shock, and were no doubt concerned when we approached in our commandeered vehicle. A death jeep decorated with human skulls isn't exactly the type of car anyone's happy to see.
Where the fuck did you get that thing?
Helen exclaimed as Kaz and I jumped out of the jeep.
And what the hell happened to you?
She added in concern, no doubt noting the blood and gore covering me from head to toe.
No time to explain. We've got to go.
I answered frantically.
Where are the others?
Helen added in confusion. Kaz answered firmly.
Dead. What about Custer?
He's dead too, I'm afraid. His injuries were too severe,
answered the doc as he suddenly emerged to greet us.
Fuck.
Kaz swore. But there was no time to grieve, as just then there was a burst of light and energy on the hillside, only yards from where we stood. They were reopening the portal from the other side, creating a passageway for our return. I scanned the base camp and saw how the team had already packed up our gear, ready to ship. It was protocol not to leave any equipment behind when we left, but this mission had already gone to shit. Still, I watched with joy as the portal opened, and I thought we were finally safe. But once again I was wrong. I heard at first the ominous drone of rotor blades, and then Juan, one of our technicians, cried out and pointed.
What the fuck is that?
I looked in that direction, horrified to see an attack helicopter approaching at great speed. It was something akin to an Apache, but of a different design, heavily armored and bristling with weapons, a swastika clearly visible on its nose. There was no time for anyone to react before the killer aircraft opened up, pumping machine gun bullets into our camp. Phil, our second technician, was caught out in the open, torn to shreds by high-velocity rounds, his body performing a macabre death dance before dropping to the dirt. Juan cried out his friend's name and had to be physically restrained by Kaz and the doc.
We've got to go. Just get through the fucking portal.
We all started running, beating a hasty retreat as the bullets kept flying. One by one, I saw my comrades descend through the portal, the doc, Juan, and then Helen. Kaz waited for me, waving and shouting frantically as I sprinted towards the opening. I don't know why, but I paused at the last moment, turning and looking up at the chopper. I saw the man in the cockpit. and was shocked because I recognized him, Steiner. His head was bandaged, but it was definitely him. I would recognize his cold, predatory stare anywhere. To my surprise, he was no longer shooting. Instead, he simply watched, observing our hasty retreat. I froze for a second, but Kaz saved my ass once again, tackling and physically shoving me through the portal entry. We left that vile world in an instant, descending into darkness and limbo before we emerged on the other side, our bodies collapsing onto the metal gangway back at the facility.
Close it!
Kaz screamed, but there was no need, as a moment later the power shut down and the link to the other world was broken. I struggled to breathe as I adjusted to my surroundings, my brain not registering that we were really safe. In an instant, we were surrounded by security men, medical staff, and technicians, all appearing shocked and frightened. And who could blame them? They'd never seen a mission go south this badly. A team of 9 had made the crossing over to Earth 217. Just 24 hours later, only 5 had returned without any of the weaponry and equipment they'd set out with. The mission had been a total clusterfuck, and I dreaded the inevitable hours and days of debriefing which would surely follow. But that's not what really scared me. I couldn't forget about Steiner, the commander who'd seen our trans-dimensional portal firsthand and was now in possession of all our team's equipment. The Nazi fuck would surely report his findings back to his superiors, and who's to say they're capable to building their own TDP, given time. The thought of those monsters crossing over to our world keeps me up at night. Still, I thought Earth 217 was the worst we would ever encounter. But once again, I was wrong. There are parallel worlds out there just as bad and perhaps even worse. I know, because I've been to them. And if the feds don't track me down before then, I'll tell you all about these hellscapes, because this is shit people need to know. Until next time, my friends. Hello, friends, and fellow seekers of truth. I'm pleased to report that I am still alive and at large, for the time being at least. For those of you who haven't read my initial account, I suggest you catch up here before reading any further. To recap, I am a whistleblower working within a top-secret government project jointly funded by the DoD and billionaire one-percenters. Our goal? To open trans-dimensional portals and visit parallel universes. Needless to say, the US government doesn't want the public knowing about this highly classified project, and so I'm taking a huge risk by revealing the details of these secret missions. But I believe people need to know the truth of what these people are doing and what huge dangers they're exposing us to. My first mission, the visit to Earth 217, is a case in point. Nazis and werewolves, that's some crazy shit, right? I wouldn't have believed it was possible had I not seen the monsters with my own 2 eyes. And I'll never forget the predatory gaze of that bastard Steiner, the Aryan hunter, who wiped out half of our team. And he saw the portal. He knows that we crossed over from an alternate version of Earth. Given their level of technology, I see no reason why those Nazi fucks can't build their own TDP. And this fear keeps me up at night. I survived Earth 217 by the skin of my teeth, but that wasn't the end of my career of trans-dimensional exploration. Far from it. But before I continue my tale of woe, I think it's worth letting you know my current status. At the time I wrote my account of the botched Earth 217 visit, I was officially on suspension from my post, pending a psychological examination. To be fair, I hadn't been in the best state of mind, and I wasn't really thinking straight when I published my account. Don't get me wrong, I don't regret telling my story to the world, but I wanted to preserve my anonymity and failed to do so. True, I didn't reveal my name or exact role in the project, but I let slip too many details of the operation, and so it wouldn't have been too difficult for my employers to identify me. I knew I'd fucked up as soon as I posted to my account. Now I'm officially on the run. Of course, I can't reveal my location. All I can say is that I'm no longer in the US, and I don't stay in the same place for long. The CIA and NSA are surely looking for me, and these people have eyes everywhere. And if the Americans don't get me, then Russians or Chinese probably will. Several foreign governments are racing to build their own TDPs, and no doubt they want access to the information I have in my head. So, simply put, my time is almost up, but I want to stay free long enough to finish my story. When I look back, I realize I should have run for the hills after the disastrous and bloody mission to Earth 217. There are a few reasons why I wouldn't and didn't do so, which I'll try my best to explain. As you'd expect, our employers and benefactors, of course, weren't happy about the clusterfuck over in Nazi world, as it became known within the project. What followed was a temporary suspension of all missions while a thorough debriefing and investigation was undertaken. I lost count of how many hours I spent in windowless briefing rooms, grilled by hard-nosed military officers and anonymous government officials, while impatient tech billionaires watched on through unsubtle two-way mirrors. All the surviving members of the team were subjected to the same interrogation, made to recount the horrific events of Earth 217 over and over again. Eventually, it became clear that they wanted a scapegoat for the bloody failure of our mission, and they found one. Our deceased commander, Custer, not his real name, of course, took the blame for the deaths on 217. After all, he had ordered the disastrous recon mission into the seemingly abandoned ghost town, leading our team straight into a deadly ambush. Perhaps he was acting on orders from higher up, but Custer wasn't around to defend himself, and so he made a convenient scapegoat. Our benefactors wanted the TDP missions to continue. They'd invested too much time and money to shut it down, and therefore, a few token changes were made to the command structure and our operational protocols, and after a couple of weeks, we were given the go-ahead to start up again. Business as usual. There were some personnel changes after the 217 disaster. One of the survivors, a tech called Juan, had quit soon after our return. He'd seen his best friend cut to pieces by machine gun bullets, and that was enough for him. Several others also quit the project, even though they'd never set foot on 217. The stories of what happened on Nazi world scared them shitless. Did I consider leaving? Certainly. The horrors I'd witnessed over there almost broke me. As you've probably guessed, I'm not a military man, and I'd never witnessed combat or bloodshed before. I'd received training, but nothing could prepare you for seeing a genetically modified werewolf tearing human beings to fucking shreds. So, why did I stay? Well, part of it was down to stubbornness, and a determination not to be beaten. But for the most part, it was due to loyalty. Loyalty to the two strongest women in my life. The first was Kaz. If you've read my account of the 217 bloodbath, you'll know Kaz saved my life on multiple occasions, literally pulling me from near death and dragging me home. Kaz was just about the only person to come out well from the 217 debacle, and the powers that be gave her a well-deserved promotion, making Kaz a team leader for future missions. I reckon Kaz is one of the strongest people I've ever known, and I respected her a lot. If she was leading missions, I wanted to be by her side. Maybe I'd get the opportunity to repay the debt. The other woman in my life was Helen, the geologist from the 217 mission, who'd played only a small role in the botched operation. There was always a chemistry between Helen and I. We'd been close during training and had nearly hooked up a few times. We'd resisted because there was a strict ban on romantic relationships between team members, and the penalty for breaking this rule was instant expulsion from the project. But things changed after 217. Helen found me late one night in our barracks canteen. I'd been drinking and was in a state of distress, struggling to cope with the trauma of what I'd witnessed. Helen took a glass and comforted me. Emotions were running high, and we ended up in bed together. I suppose it was a mistake, but it certainly didn't feel like one. We agreed to keep seeing each other in secret, keeping our relationship hidden from our bosses. We talked about leaving the project and starting a new life together. But in truth, I knew this wasn't what Helen wanted. She hadn't seen the full horrors of Earth-217 and still held an idealistic yearning for adventure. She wanted to discover new worlds and considered her work on the project as the opportunity of a lifetime. And there seemed no way she would walk away from this. The other survivor of 217 was the Doc, our medical attendant who'd failed to save Custer's life after the werewolf attack. The Doc had been oddly unaffected by the horrors on 217. He continued to act in a bizarre manner and didn't engage much with the other team members. Nevertheless, the medical man clearly had no intention of leaving the project. Believe it or not, the first few missions conducted after 217 all went without a hitch. We visited alternate worlds not too dissimilar to our own, took our samples, and carried out our research. We kept our heads low and returned home without any losses, reporting the findings to our superiors. So far, so good. But all these cakewalks started making people complacent. And our benefactors were relentless. They kept on ordering new missions in their search for a Goldilocks world, an untapped alternate Earth suitable for colonization and excavation. They'd invested too much money on this project to not see it through to its conclusion, and we went along with their insane plan. I suppose it's like any dangerous activity one might undertake, whether it's swimming with the sharks or freediving off the side of a cliff. You might be fine 9 times out of 10, but on the 10th occasion you'll end up losing a limb or cracking your skull open. And we got lucky for a time. But then we visited Earth 312, and it all went to hell. I'd like to say I felt the same dread in the moments before we crossed over to 312, but I didn't. I'd been on 6 missions by this point, and the previous 5 had gone without a hitch. Kaz was leading the team, and she exerted a quiet confidence. Kaz, Helen, the Doc, and I had achieved something of legendary status within the project. The newer team members all looked up to us, knowing we'd survived the disaster on 217. Our team had been strengthened to 10 men and women, half of which were security personnel. We also had access to heavier weapons, such as a portable Stinger missile. I was certain we wouldn't fall into the same trap as before. The crossing over was routine. I recall standing in line, equipment at the ready as the spectrometer came to life and power surged through the conductors. It was always terrifying for me when the bunker lit up and the portal was opened, creating an impossible entryway to another dimension. But when I looked into Helen's eyes, I saw her excitement, the thrill she experienced as the prospect of discovering a new world hit her. This is what she lived for. Kaz wasn't one for big speeches. Her goal was to ensure all our personnel and equipment got through within the tight 2-minute window. This task was achieved with typical military efficiency, as men and women pushed bikes and steel containers down the purposefully built rails and towards the gateway, while Kaz screamed in encouragement. I took a deep breath before it was my turn to cross, pausing briefly as I experienced a moment of hesitation before I mustered the courage to walk through the fluid membrane. There followed the usual period of intense panic. I couldn't breathe as my brain reacted to the fact that I technically didn't exist in any universe at that moment. But as always, this hellish state of limbo only lasted the briefest of flashes. Seconds later, my body spilled out on the other side, and I landed heavily in the dirt. I gasped for breath as I struggled to recompose myself. Thankfully, I didn't vomit on this occasion. It wouldn't have looked good if I puked in front of the new recruits. Helen was there for me, as always, helping me to my feet and greeting me with a coy smile. Helen wasn't affected by the experience as severely as I was, and it was always a relief to see her face on the other side.
You okay?
She asked softly. Yeah, I'm fine, I answered, trying to sound manly as I got up on my 2 feet. I observed the security team setting up a defensive perimeter and the technicians activating our equipment, preparing to begin their analysis. I looked across the landscape and across at the rising sun, seeing rolling hills, trees, and bushes, nothing I would consider abnormal. But of course, appearances can be deceptive. Helen gently touched me on my shoulder, whispering in my ear.
Well, honey, I guess we better get back to work.
I nodded my head, glancing longingly at Helen and staring into her deep, green eyes for a brief moment before I caught myself. I wanted more than anything to embrace and kiss her right then and there, but knew I couldn't. She smiled at me before breaking eye contact and marching off towards her work, and I did the same, preparing for the coming hours, where it would be my task to watch and analyze the intercepted broadcasts and drone footage, and what I saw sickened me to my very soul. We reconvened that afternoon to share the results of our analysis, sitting cross-legged in the middle of our base camp as Kaz carefully listened to what we had to say. The briefings from Helen and the others proved unremarkable. There was nothing in the atmosphere or the soil which could cause concern on the surface. Earth 312 looked not too much different from our own world. I sat and listened in silence, my stomach churning as the horrifying images I'd seen permeated my subconscious. When it was finally my turn to speak, I could hardly open my quaking lips. Eventually, Kaz had to prompt me.
Well, what have you got for us? Judging by the look on your face, it's not good news.
Man, was she right. I thought, but didn't say. So, the television broadcasts we intercepted are disturbing. Every channel seems to focus on extreme pornography and violence.
Not much different from back home, then,
quipped Jackson, one of our team's technicians. A sharp look from Kaz was enough to shut him up, and reluctantly I continued. The images I've seen are well in excess of anything I've witnessed before, and they certainly have no artistic merit that I can see. The violence is graphic, but also ritualistic in nature.
What? Do you mean like human sacrifices?
Exactly, I confirmed with a lump in my throat. I'm no expert on cinematography, but I have some experience of violence. Based on what I've seen, I believe these people are filming and broadcasting real assaults and murders.
And who are these people? What do we know about the society on this world?
Kaz interjected. She held my gaze while waiting for my answer. The rest of the team were also listening intently. There were no more jokes. In fact, the tension was almost unbearable and the fear palpable. No doubt everyone was thinking of the bloodbath on 217 and fearing a repeat. In reality, I hadn't told them the half of it. The vile images I'd seen, brutal assaults, torture sessions, cannibalism, it almost defied belief. The society here is vastly different from our own, I continued, basically stating the obvious. The population has a twisted moral compass. Indeed, it's difficult to see any sense of morality or compassion whatsoever. They have a religion of sorts, but it appears to be steeped in a dark, ritualistic cruelty. Based on what I've seen, I believe the entire basis of their society is violence and sadism. But in spite of all this, The civilization of this world is technologically advanced and, in my opinion, extremely dangerous. You could have heard a pin drop at that moment. I looked around the faces of my team members and noted their collective look of horror. I caught Helen's eye for a moment, sharing her gaze. She smiled in an attempt to reassure me, but I could sense something was off with her. Kaz didn't show any outward signs of emotion, however, as her hardened gaze cut right through me. She spoke up to make herself heard over the panicked mutters of her team.
What about the drone footage? What did the UAV pick up?
She demanded. I broke eye contact, shaking my head. Well, the local area is more heavily populated than in our own world, and the nearby town appears to be something of a hub. This obviously wasn't good. The success of our mission depended on our team getting in and out without drawing attention, and obviously this was less likely if there were more people around. But this wasn't even the half of it.
Did you see any potential threats?
Kaz asked, carefully, bringing the conversation back to business. I actually didn't have the words to answer this question. Instead, I opened a new window on my laptop, playing a recording of the video footage taken by the drone as it flew over the nearby town. Kaz and the team huddled around, all watching closely as the scene played out. The drone hovered over what, at a glance, appeared to be a typical small town in Middle America. Unlike the long-abandoned ghost town we'd found in Earth-217, this version was a thriving settlement, with well-maintained streets, well-stocked stores, and modern automobiles driven by seemingly normal people. The central hub of the town was a large building which looked like some sort of temple, complete with a steeple and adorned with unfamiliar symbols. This was unusual, but nothing of great concern. That was until the camera zoomed in on a scene of utter horror. What we saw were 3 human bodies, all naked. 1 woman and 2 men. All 3 had been impaled. And I mean literally fucking impaled. With steel spikes driven through them from anus to mouth. Their lifeless pale faces staring up into the sky, while their limp bodies hung like sides of beef, slowly decomposing in the cool autumn air. It was truly horrific. Fuck, someone swore. Jesus Christ! Exclaimed another. And I heard someone retching in the background. Perhaps I shouldn't have shown these awful images without a warning, but I couldn't think of any other way to alert them to the seriousness of our situation. Things might have descended into anarchy at that moment, but luckily Kaz took control and restored order.
Listen up, people,
she shouted.
This is not the time to panic. We've been in this situation before and learned from our mistakes. I have no intention of leading our team down there. We stay here, secure the perimeter, and sit tight until they reopen the portal.
She paused to look at her watch.
Extraction is in 18 hours. If we keep our heads down, no one will notice we're here, and we'll all get home in one piece. Now you all know your jobs. Remember your training and get to it.
Her pep talk seemed to do the job, as my team members nodded their heads in acknowledgement and moved out. I wished I could share their confidence. Sure, Kaz was a good leader and she wouldn't fuck things up like Custer had. But still, 18 hours was a long time to be stuck in a hostile environment, and I had a terrible feeling that history was repeating itself. The next few hours passed by in relative peace. There was a downpour of rain during the afternoon, which left us soaked and did little to improve our already low morale. The atmosphere was tense, but didn't descend into panic. We all had our jobs to do, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't watching the clock the whole time. I was thankful to get some alone time with Helen as we crouched down together, hidden behind a stack of steel containers. We shared a passionate kiss, before speaking in hushed tones to avoid being overheard.
I know you're worried.
Helen said sympathetically as she held me tight and looked deep into my eyes.
But it's going to be okay. This isn't 217. Kaz knows what she's doing and she'll get us home safe. We'll never have to visit this hell world again.
Yeah, I suppose, I replied, without much confidence. I just can't understand why people do these things. How can they treat their fellow human beings with such cruelty? It's fucking sick. The light in Helen's eyes faded as she broke my gaze and shook her head in disgust.
I know. It's evil, pure and simple. I don't think I fully understood until now. Seeing those bodies with spikes driven through them, put out on display like fucking Christmas trees. Sick doesn't even cover it.
She paused briefly, and when she raised her head, I saw tears forming in her beautiful eyes.
You know, I always thought of these missions as adventures. I loved the idea of discovering and exploring new worlds, and I guess I was blind to the risks. Even when I saw that poor guy getting killed on 217, I still didn't get it. I didn't get where you were coming from.
I listened intently, wondering where she was going with this.
I think this mission should be our last. I want to leave the project so we can be together, so we can start a life together.
Are you sure? I blurted out, hardly believing what I was hearing. In that moment, I felt total elation. She nodded her head in the affirmative, and I hugged her in a tight embrace as tears ran down my cheek. Thank you, I whispered.
Dry these tears, big boy,
She replied.
We need to get back to our posts before we're missed.
I nodded my head, composing myself before I kissed Helen with all the passion I could muster. Then we emerged from our hiding place, returning to our work with a renewed sense of hope. But of course, I wasn't complacent, because we were still a long way from home and by no means safe. It wasn't long before the peace was broken as our tech team alerted Kaz to a situation. Jackson had gathered everybody around to watch his screen, and what we saw was the live footage from the aerial drone, which was conducting a security sweep of the vicinity. It hovered over a small road which led up the hillside, close to our base camp. I was horrified to see a small convoy of SUVs speeding along the narrow road, loaded up with armed men and women, all carrying what looked like hunting rifles.
Fuck.
Kaz swore. A moment later, a gunman riding in the rear of the lead SUV spotted our drone. He quickly raised his rifle and opened fire, hitting the drone and ending the feed. And we all just stood there, dumbstruck and staring at the now blank screen. I felt a cold chill running down my spine as I realized my worst fear had come to pass. The sick fucks knew we were here, and they were coming for us. Once again, the camp might have descended into blind mania, but Kaz took charge.
Okay, people, this is bad, but we always knew it was a possibility, and we've planned for this scenario. I'll lead a team and draw the hostiles away from this location. If necessary, we'll engage and neutralize the enemy. The rest of the team will stay here and secure the camp. When it's time, we'll meet you back here and complete the evac. Is everybody clear?
We all nodded and answered in the affirmative. It was a risky plan, but we had no other choice. Kaz took 3 of her security people with her as they descended down the hillside, armed to the teeth. She left 1 man behind to defend the base, a twitchy military veteran named Carter, and the rest of us were civilians with little to no combat experience. In addition to Helen and myself, there was Doc, our medical attendant and fellow 217 survivor, and our 2 technicians, a middle-aged man named Jackson and a younger woman called Rachel. The light was fading by this point, the sun slowly disappearing on the far horizon. The onset of darkness brought a new level of fear to an already tense situation. The only one unaffected was the Doc, who seemed disconnected from reality as he stared out into the abyss. We warily looked out upon the foliage, which surrounded our base camp, jumping at every gust of wind or snapped twig. Carter kept in radio contact with Kaz and her team, who were closing in on the armored convoy. Prospect of a gun battle only added to our anxiety. The only thing which kept me going was Helen, as I stayed by her side and dreamt of the future we'd have together. If we got out of this hellscape, that is. Suddenly, Carter abandoned his radio call and focused his attention on the darkened perimeter. "What the fuck was that?" he exclaimed, dropping down onto one knee and aiming his M4 towards the tree line. I couldn't see a thing, but obviously he had, and his military instincts were kicking in. "Get behind me," he whispered, whilst preparing his rifle to fire. But he never got the chance. A second later, a shot rang out, and Carter fell to the dirt like a lifeless ragdoll. I gasped in horror as I looked down upon our guardian's corpse and saw the bullet had torn through his right eye, apparently killing him instantly. "Jesus Christ!" I swore in dismay. Helen screamed when she saw the body, while Jackson and Rachel ran to Carter's side. But then, 2 further shots rang out, except they sounded different this time. More a soft popping sound rather than a harsh crack of a rifle. I saw our 2 technicians fall in quick succession, looking at their bodies and seeing what I thought were tranquilizer darts protruding from their chests. "Shit!" I swore again, as I almost succumbed to blind panic. Instead, I grabbed Helen's hand and screamed in her ear, "We've got to get out of here!" But it was already too late. There was another soft pop, and a third dart struck Helen in her ribcage. She let out a surprised gasp as she fell. I caught her body in my arms, crying her name as I watched her eyes roll into her head, and a moment later she lost consciousness. I gently laid my lover down on the grass, the anger swelling up inside me as I stood, determined to face our attackers no matter what the risk. I saw a figure emerge from the tree line, wearing furs and a mask fashioned from an animal skull. He carried some kind of rifle, which was aimed directly at me. I guessed that this was the tranquilizer gun he'd used to shoot the others. I stood up to the hunter, my heart full of rage and defiance. He placed his finger on the trigger and called out in open mockery. "Do you surrender?" came the booming voice. "Go fuck yourself," I shot back. He laughed cruelly before firing a single shot. The dart struck me in the chest only an inch from my heart. I felt a stab of pain as the air was sucked from my lungs and all the strength left my body. Before I knew it, I was falling, my limp body crashing heavily to the ground. And a moment later, my eyes shut and darkness overcame me. I awoke to screaming, my brain alerting me to the danger even though my body was still trying to recover from the shock. I fought through the pain as I struggled to open my eyes. I also couldn't move and soon discovered why, as they'd bound me to a chair and secured my neck using a leather collar. I was completely helpless and at the mercy of my captors. I groggily opened my eyes and tried to make sense of my surroundings. They were holding me hostage inside a building which I can only describe as a cross between a church and a torture chamber, with a foul stench and only a dim light emanating from the candles and lanterns. Rows of pews were set up throughout the hall, all facing towards an altar adorned with what looked like satanic symbols and tapestries depicting images of extreme violence and bloodshed. But this wasn't the worst of it, not by a long shot. I saw Helen in front of the altar, bound to what looked like a medical gurney. Her clothes had been removed, and they dressed her in a white gown which barely covered her naked flesh. In a panic, I called out her name and fought against my binds, but to no avail. It's the worst feeling in the world, to see someone you love in such danger and being unable to help them. Thankfully, Helen was still unconscious at this point. I could see her chest rising and so knew that she was still breathing, but otherwise she was completely oblivious. So where was the screaming coming from? Who was emitting the cries of agony ringing in my ears? I soon got my answer as I looked up above the altar, and what I saw both sickened and terrified me. It was Jackson, our technician. They'd literally crucified him, nailing him to a cross with spikes forced through his wrists and ankles. Clearly, he was in immense pain as he screamed and begged for mercy.
Please, get me down from here. It fucking hurts so bad.
As I glanced around the hall, I saw 4 figures standing guard, all dressed in the same manner as the hunter who'd captured me. Figures adorned in animal furs and masks fashioned from skulls and with either tranquilizer guns or hunting rifles slung along their shoulders. They looked on dispassionately, ignoring Jackson's pleas for mercy as they maintained their ghoulish vigil. A moment later, a new figure opened and entered the room. A woman with blood-red hair and wearing robes to match. She glided down the aisle with the utmost confidence, and all the assembled hunters moved to make way for her. She looked down upon me like I was nothing, her dark eyes full of malice. This woman was beautiful for sure, but I could tell that she was very dangerous. The mood darkened when she entered, and I noted the array of sharp daggers she carried in a belt fastened around her red robes.
Fresh meat for our sacrifice,
she said, whilst looking over me with total contempt. Somehow, I managed to open my mouth and speak through quaking lips. "You can't do this!"
Oh, can I? And who's going to stop me? You?
The woman replied in open mockery. "You don't understand," I continued frantically. "We're not from your world. We're not part of this. This has nothing to do with us." "Oh, I'm afraid they know all too well who you are and where you come from." A newcomer spoke these words, and to my shock I recognized the voice. I turned my head as far as my restrictive collar would allow and came face to face with Doc, our team's medical man, who I'd forgotten all about during the chaos of our capture. To my astonishment, Doc wasn't bound like the rest of us. In fact, he walked freely by the side of the Red Priestess, acting like her ally rather than her prisoner. "Doc, what the hell are you doing?" I exclaimed in confusion. "Oh, I am sorry, my old friend," he replied calmly. "But I've told them everything. They know all about the project and the TDP technology, and I've committed to working alongside them going forward." I shook my head in disbelief. I'd always known there was something off with the doc, but had never imagined he'd do something like this. A dozen questions were racing through my head at that moment, but I asked the most obvious. "Why?" The doc nodded his head before answering. "This society seems brutish to us, but have you considered the possibilities? Here, we have a people unconstrained by conventional morality. Imagine the potential for scientific advancement. Think what we can discover about the human mind and body when we push a man to the very limits of physical and psychological endurance. Theirs is an offer I simply cannot refuse. And frankly, I think our higher-ups would appreciate the work I could do here." The rage welled up inside of me. The doc's betrayal was unforgivable. "You fucking traitor!" I screamed.
Okay,
Interrupted the red woman.
that's enough talk. Silence him.
She motioned to one of the masked hunters, and he advanced upon me, roughly jamming a ball gag into my mouth and securing it firmly. I tried to cry out in protest, but my voice was muffled by the gag, and I was entirely helpless and unable to resist.
Bring out the next tribute.
A moment later, 2 of the hunters dragged out our second technician, Rachel. force marching her towards the waiting altar. She kicked and screamed the entire way, somehow breaking free from their grasp and kicking one of the hunters hard in the testicles. She tried to flee down the aisle, but the Red Priestess reacted in an instant, pulling a knife from her belt and throwing it through the air. The blade struck Rachel between her shoulder blades, and she fell to the floor, letting out a pained cry before she stopped moving.
Damn it!
Screamed the Red Woman as she directed her anger towards the two masked hunters.
If you idiots fuck up again, I'll cut you open and let the worms feed on your innards.
The men lowered their heads in shame and fear. Clearly they knew this was no idle threat. She continued.
Glory to the Dark Lord. We offer these tributes as a sign of our fealty.
I could only watch in abject horror as she withdrew another dagger from her belt and advanced towards the altar. She turned, glaring directly at me while she spoke her chilling words.
May their fear and pain bring you renewed strength.
At that moment, she was interrupted by a fresh chorus of screams from Jackson, the poor bastard literally nailed to a cross.
Please, dear God, please help me!
Shut the fuck up, worm.
The priestess cried in fury. A second later, she stabbed him repeatedly in his chest and stomach, brutally ending his life in a savage attack. To my dismay, Helen chose that moment to regain consciousness, remaining woozy as she opened her eyes and struggled against her binds.
Where am I?
She whispered.
What's happening?
She said, growing fearful. I desperately tried to call out to her, but the gag muffled my cries. The Red Woman saw me struggling frantically against my binds and surely guessed the reason why. With a twisted smile on her lips, she said,
So, this pretty little thing means something to you?
Tears streamed down my cheeks as I shook my head vigorously.
Well,
she continued with a wicked glint in her eye.
I'm going to do you a favor. I'll grant your little girlfriend the mercy of a quick death.
I watched helplessly, my whole body shaking as I watched that evil bitch approaching my lover, knife in hand. Helen was now alert enough to recognize the danger, and I could see the terror in her eyes and hear the fear in her voice.
What are you doing?
Helen screamed.
Don't do this! Get the fuck away from me!
The Red Woman's sadistic grin widened as she raised her dagger, holding it above the bound Helen as she cried out in terror. I made one last desperate attempt to escape from my binds, mustering all my strength. I managed to break the screws which had secured my chair to the ground, but only succeeded in collapsing to the floor, my wrists still bound to the chair arms. I emitted one last muffled cry as I looked up in time to see the dagger stabbing downwards, plunging deep through Helen's chest and into her heart. I closed my eyes and experienced an indescribable pain as I wished the ground would swallow me up.
Get him up,
screamed the priestess. A moment later, I was being pulled up by two of the masked hunters. I reluctantly opened my eyes and was devastated to see Helen's lifeless body lying on the gurney. The Red Woman calmly wiped the blood from her dagger before advancing upon me.
I showed her mercy,
she said, while approaching with the knife in hand.
But you won't be so lucky. I'm going to peel your skin off piece by piece, keep you alive for as long as I can. Your agony brings glory to the Lord of Darkness.
My body shook as I focused on her twisted smile, predatory eyes, and the dagger she brandished so deftly. The hunters held me down as the cold steel touched my skin, and she began to cut. There was a mighty blast which rocked the room, and then all hell broke loose, with men screaming and bullets flying. I turned my head in time to see Kaz and her security team burst into the hall, laying down suppressing fire with their M4s. One after one, the hunters fell, under a hail of gunfire, ruthlessly and efficiently eliminated by Kaz and her men. The priestess initially seemed taken aback by the sudden assault, but she soon recovered, acting out of pure rage.
How dare you interrupt this sacred ritual?
She screamed. A split second later, she threw her dagger, sticking one of the security troops right through his eye, killing him instantly. Kaz responded at once, screaming,
Go to hell, bitch!
She fired a single round from her M4, blowing the red woman's head clean off. I watched with grim satisfaction as her body hit the floor. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun, the hellish temple now strewn with dead bodies.
Cut him loose.
Kaz ordered, and a moment later my gag was removed and the binds cut. Once free, my first move was to run to Helen's side. I still held a slim hope that she'd survived, but when I saw her cold body and face drained of blood, I realized that there was no hope. She was dead, and I'd failed to save her. I cried uncontrollably as I touched her soft skin, still not wanting to believe I'd really lost her. Kaz grabbed me by my shoulder, pulling me away from Helen's body.
We've got to go!
She shouted. I shook my head vigorously. I can't leave her! I replied emotionally. Kaz pulled me closer, forcing me to look her in the eye.
She's gone. We need to get out of here, otherwise we're dead too.
I didn't want to listen, but I knew that she was right. Just then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked over Kaz's shoulder and saw a figure emerging from behind the altar. And it was a face I recognized. The Doc. Once again, I had forgotten about him during all the chaos. But evidently, he survived the gun battle. Worse still, I saw he'd armed himself with one of the discarded hunting rifles, and he was aiming directly at Kaz's back. Look out! I screamed as I shoved my team leader out of the line of fire. A shot rang out. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder, like I'd been stabbed with a red-hot poker, and suddenly I was falling, collapsing down to the floor with a bullet inside of me. I heard shouting and more gunfire before once again I blacked out. What happened next is something of a blur in my memory. As I dropped in and out of consciousness, I recall being dragged out of the blood-soaked temple and piled into a commandeered vehicle. There was some further gunfire as we made a frantic escape out of the town and sped up the hillside back to the extraction point. I must have blacked out again at this point, because I remember nothing about our return to Earth 1. My next memory was waking up in the medical bay after emergency surgery to my shoulder. The doctors kept telling me how lucky I was to still be alive, but I sure as hell didn't feel lucky. And so that's it. My tragic love story. One of pain, loss, and guilt. I just keep thinking back to our last conversation together, to our last kiss and embrace. We were so damn close to being free from all of this. Only a few short hours and we would have been safe. Now I can't sleep at night, because when I close my eyes, all I see is that fucking dagger plunging into Helen's heart. In addition to my personal loss, The Earth 312 mission had been a total disaster, even more so than 217. We'd lost more than half of our team and once again had left behind our dead and almost all of our equipment. And what's worse, that treacherous bastard had escaped during the chaos. Doc was still alive, and no doubt he would share his entire knowledge of the project with those sick sadistic fucks who roll Earth 312 just to save his own skin. You'd think that after 2 disastrous missions and multiple casualties, that the powers that be would have pulled the plug on the whole project. But of course they didn't. Those assholes only care about money and results, not about human lives. They'll just keep going and going until they get what they want. It may surprise you, but I decided to stay on the project, even after losing Helen on 312. In fact, I went straight back to work as soon as my gunshot wound had healed. Why, you may ask? It's hard to explain. I mean, I suppose I had a death wish after Helen died. I didn't care whether I lived or died, as my heart was filled with rage and a lust for revenge. I wanted to seek out monsters like Steiner and the Red Priestess and end them. In my warped mind, I thought I could stop atrocities and save people by stopping these evil fucks. But of course, it was futile. What difference can one man make in a multiverse full of horrors? Okay. I need to go now. It's time to move on from this place. Assuming I avoid the grasp of the various government agencies hunting me down, I intend to tell you one last story. An account of an Earth ruled by monsters from another planet. Until next time, my friends, stay safe. Greetings, friends and truth seekers. I'm writing this with a heavy heart, and I believe this will be my last account before the government catches up with me. I've had too many close calls already, and I know my luck will run out. And to be honest, I'm tired of running. This is no way to live. To recap, I am a whistleblower and former participant in a top-secret government-run experiment. Its objective? To open portals to alternate universes, deploy survey teams, and seek out a world fit for a seed colony. If you haven't read my previous accounts, I suggest you do so now. Once you've learned the true extent of the horrors on Earth 217 and 312, I hope you'll understand why I've done this. Why I've effectively sacrificed my own life to tell the world the truth. The bloodbath on Earth 312 really fucked me up. I don't think there's any way to describe what it's like to see the woman you love brutally murdered in front of your eyes, all while being powerless to prevent it. That horrifying memory will haunt me to my dying day. The Earth 312 mission was a disaster, and once again our bosses, government officials, senior military officers, and tech billionaires, they all wanted answers. Weeks of investigations and recriminations inevitably followed. We never discovered the history of Earth 312 or the truth behind the brutal society which inhabited it. Our anthropology team has various theories based upon our findings, Perhaps a civilization where Satanism became the dominant world religion, or a death cult who'd somehow formed a functioning global government. Naturally, nobody's in a rush to go back there and start asking those psychopaths questions. Unfortunately, they know all about us thanks to the traitor on our team. Doc, our medical attendant on 312, defected and joined the enemy, jumping at the opportunity to perform his twisted experiments on live human subjects. In exchange, he will tell his sadistic new masters everything he knows about trans-dimensional portal travel, no doubt helping them to develop their own technology. The heavy losses on 312 didn't deter the powers that be, however. Once again, they made a few cosmetic changes to our personnel and operating procedures before giving the go-ahead for new missions. By that point, I had barely survived 2 disastrous operations upon hellish alternate worlds. I'd been bitten, beaten, tortured, and shot, and had seen friends and colleagues slaughtered in horrific circumstances. I was betrayed by a once trusted team member, and worse yet, I watched the woman I loved get brutally murdered, and in an instant my entire future was wiped out. I should have left the project, of course. Why didn't I? That's a question for my psychiatrist, I suppose. Call it a death wish or an unhealthy desire for revenge. Either way, I was operating like a zombie, going from mission to mission whilst taking reckless risks. It seems unbelievable, but the bosses actually promoted me to team leader around this time. I don't know why they did something so stupid, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was for 2 reasons. Firstly, I was one of the few team members to have survived from the early days of the project. Most of my contemporaries were either dead or had quit. The other reason was their decision to transfer the leadership of the project from the military to civilian personnel. 217 and 312, those missions were both under military command, and both had ended in bloody disaster. Kaz had taken the blame for the deaths on 312, even though it wasn't really her fault. Still, our bosses needed a scapegoat, and Kaz was the team leader. They would have canned Kaz if I hadn't interceded on her behalf. It was the least I could do. After all, she'd come back to rescue me from that damn torture chamber on 312. I just wish she'd arrived in time to save Helen. The next few missions were largely uneventful. We had a few cakewalks and a couple of close shaves. Nevertheless, we didn't encounter anything on the scale of 217 or 312. No Nazi super soldiers, no genetically modified werewolves or satanic death cults. Even so, I always sensed that it was only a matter of time before we ran into another disaster. The multiverse is populated by monsters. I don't think the bosses ever realized the full extent of the threats we face from the evil regimes on the other side of these portals. That was until we crossed over to Earth 537. After that clusterfuck of a mission, all bets were off. The atmosphere on the morning of our crossing was undeniably tense, although this had in fact become the norm. Gone were the days of idealistic scientists and researchers eager to explore and discover the secrets of these new worlds. Those naive types were long gone, either dead, retired, or turned into world-weary cynics like me. Other than Kaz and myself, the rest of my team were a combination of trigger-happy mercenaries and washed-up academics, lacking the proper training and field experience. The quality of our recruits had gone downhill since the early days of the project. I was the leader of this ragtag band of misfits and renegades, on paper at least. Yeah, they followed my orders on base, but if the shit hit the fan on the other side, I didn't know what would happen. In the moments before the crossover, I stood at the front of the line in the bunker, a crate full of equipment at my feet, ready to push down the rail once the portal opened. I watched on as the machinery was activated and power surged. The initialization process had begun. This part used to scare the shit out of me, as I imagined all the horrific things which could go wrong. But now I hardly cared. I glanced across to my long-suffering companion Kaz, who stood beside me in her body armor with an M4 carbine slung over her shoulder. She met my gaze briefly, showing just the slightest glint of vulnerability in her eyes, a chink in her armor, which only lasted for a moment. I thought she might say something, but instead she regained her rock-hard composure, nodding curtly before turning her attention back to the operation. Kaz was the toughest person I'd ever met, and she'd saved my ass more times than I could remember. But all this horror had taken a toll on her too. Suddenly, the room filled with light and a wave of heat hit us. The portal opened as it had done 100 times before, creating an impossible passageway to another world. I looked with despair at the fluid membrane before me, not wanting to step through but knowing I ultimately would. Kaz's shout brought me back to reality as she screamed instructions to the team, ordering them forwards and making sure they got all our equipment through before the portal closed. The deployment wasn't the best, not nearly as smooth as back in the day, but we just about made it. I remember little about my crossing on that occasion. It used to be the most terrifying experience imaginable for me, to cross over into the abyss and face the emptiness between the two universes. The darkness used to frighten me, but not anymore. An eternity trapped in limbo seemed preferable to the living hell my existence had become. Now the crossings were easy compared to what they had been. I walked out on the other side of the portal and managed to keep the contents of my stomach. But as soon as I took my first breath of air, I knew something was wrong.
Everybody, respirators on!
My brain was racing and lungs burning as I almost succumbed to panic. Thankfully, I remembered my training, dropped my backpack, and reached inside with shaking hands. I quickly withdrew my respirator mask, clumsily placing it over my eyes, face, and mouth before securing the strap and breathing purified air. I struggled to adjust to a situation that had deteriorated so quickly. I looked around for the first time and was relieved to see all of my team members had also applied their masks and appeared to be uninjured. That was something, at least. However, as I surveyed the scene around me, I soon realized we were in trouble. The sky above us was an unnatural shade of red, and the soil beneath our feet was dead. In fact, the whole landscape was barren, without a living creature or plant to be seen. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought we'd been transported to the surface of Mars. But this was Earth, or rather a hellish version of it. My team members were all still hanging at the insertion point, all appearing confused and frightened. Kaz was shouting out orders through her mask's communicator. She commanded the security team to establish a defensive perimeter, and for the technicians to set up their equipment and begin their analysis. My team members reluctantly complied, knowing they had no real choice but to follow protocol. I switched on my communicator and approached my lead technician, a young man named Tyler, who was, in fairness, one of the more competent members of my ragtag team.
What the hell happened?
I demanded. I could see the look of shock and surprise through the visor on his mask.
I don't know, boss. It's not my fault. The initial readings detected toxins in the air. It might be safe to breathe, but I'm just following protocol. Okay,
I said, backing down somewhat. To be fair, Tyler was just doing his job, but obviously someone had fucked up. Situations like this weren't meant to happen, and we all knew it.
Looks like the probe malfunctioned.
Kaz suggested as she joined our conversation.
I guess,
I replied with some cynicism. It was standard procedure to send in a robot to check out the atmosphere and conditions before a team was sent in to explore a new world. If the probe detected dangerous toxins in the air or soil or significant levels of background radiation, the manned mission was supposed to be aborted. Clearly, this hadn't happened on this occasion. In my mind, there were two possible reasons why. The first was that the probe had indeed malfunctioned, or that the data it sent back to Earth-1 had been corrupted or misinterpreted. The alternative was a more cynical explanation, that our bosses had known Earth-537 wasn't safe, but decided to send us in anyway. The project leadership had already shown a total disregard for human life, and no doubt they considered us all expendable. I experienced a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, one of utter despair. But I decided not to communicate my fears to my team members. Morale was low enough already, and frankly, I feared a mutiny. I tried to compose myself and remain calm as I continued to press Tyler for information.
All right, well, are we in immediate danger?
I asked sternly.
I don't know yet.
He replied sheepishly.
Honestly, I'll need to run more tests to find out what exactly we're dealing with. Well, get to it, please.
I ordered, watching as Tyler reached for his equipment and laptop. I'd give him space to complete his analysis, but we all knew it wouldn't make much of a difference either way. The portal was closed, and our colleagues on the other side wouldn't reopen the passageway for another 24 hours. If our respirators failed, or provided inadequate protection against the hostile atmosphere, well, frankly, we were fucked. All we could do was sit here, in this lifeless wasteland, waiting to see whether we'd die from exposure to this unfriendly environment, whilst simultaneously praying that some other disaster didn't befall us within the next 24 hours. Words can't describe how much I hated our bosses at the moment. Time passed as we waited for the results of Tyler's analysis. We sat cross-legged, looking across the dead landscape, staring in dread-filled awe at the bloody red sky as a cold wind blew over our exposed hillside. Our respirators didn't give out, so the chances of us all suffocating to death were getting slimmer. However, this didn't mean we hadn't been exposed to a lethal dose of radiation, which would result in a slow and painful death, even if we did make it back to our Earth. To say the situation was tense would be an immense understatement. It took the combined efforts of Kaz and me to keep the team calm. After some time, I approached Tyler's makeshift workstation, looking over his shoulder as he frowned at the data appearing on his laptop screen.
The atmosphere is unlike anything we've seen before on any world we visited. It's like someone is deliberately trying to modify the atmosphere and ecology,
Tyler said.
What do you mean?
I demanded. This conversation certainly wasn't filling me with confidence. Tyler looked up from his laptop to meet my gaze, his eyes visible through his visor.
You ever heard of terraforming, boss?
Terraforming. This term conjured images of science fiction in my mind, of missions to Mars and plans to make alien planets habitable for human colonists. But why the hell would anyone do that here on Earth? I was about to ask Tyler that very question before I got interrupted.
The fuck is that?
Screamed Martinez, one of our security personnel. He pointed to the far horizon, and I looked to the sky and was horrified to see 3 small dots appearing, some type of aircraft, quickly approaching our position.
We've got incoming. Defensive positions now,
ordered Kaz. Our security personnel reacted slowly, prompting Kaz to shout a fresh set of orders, while she simultaneously ran to one of the steel containers to withdraw a weapon. I watched on in awe and horror as the trio of aircraft descended from the crimson skies. As they sped ever closer, I was able to identify their features, but this only added to my terror. The 3 aircraft appeared similar to unmanned drones, but their design was ugly and alien to my eyes. Saucer-shaped, jet-black robots adorned with an array of unfamiliar but deadly-looking weapons. The 3 aerial drones were headed straight for our location, and we had nowhere to run or hide. Suddenly, there was an almighty blast, followed by a streak of white as a missile tore through the air. A second later, the projectile hit the lead drone, causing a huge explosion and turning the aircraft into a ball of flames. I watched the wrecked drone fall to the earth, and then turned in astonishment to see Kaz holding a Stinger missile launcher. She'd acted fast, taking out the lead drone, but the other 2 kept on coming. The second drone opened fire with some sort of projectile. Luckily, Kaz saw the attack coming, dropping the launcher and jumping out of the way just in time. The rocket hit a second later, causing a mighty blast and leaving a small crater in the ground. And in that moment, all hell broke loose. Both surviving drones opened up indiscriminately with rockets and explosive rounds, causing utter carnage. I heard shouts and screams, saw men and women running in blind panic, but there was nowhere for them to go. I watched in shock as my team members were cut down one by one. In an instant, Tyler's head was blown clean off by a high-velocity round, his limp body collapsing into the dirt like a lifeless ragdoll. Some of the security men tried to fight back, dropping down to one knee and opening fire with their M4s, but they didn't last long. Martinez was hit square in the chest by a rocket, his body literally exploding, covering everything in blood, flesh, and bone fragments. It was horrific, but there was nothing I could do. With nowhere to run and no way to defend myself, I simply stood there and waited for death. But it didn't come. A moment later, I felt a firm hand on my shoulder, pulling me back from the brink. It was Kaz, of course, my savior once again.
Let's get the hell out of here,
she urged. We jumped on one of the quad bikes that had survived the onslaught, with Kaz driving. She revved the accelerator and we sped off, leaving the carnage behind us. One of the drones continued the slaughter of our team members and destruction of our equipment. The second broke off to pursue us. Kaz zigzagged through the dirt as high-velocity rounds exploded all around us. Our bike wasn't fast enough and there was no cover. It seemed like we'd only delayed the inevitable and we'd be blown to smithereens within seconds. But then, a powerful shot rang out above our heads. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the killer drone had taken a hit, its navigation system apparently damaged as it swayed over to one side. A second shot rang out, and the drone fell from the sky, crashing down heavily into the dirt. I hadn't seen where the shots came from, but a moment later there was a gruff cry from our left-hand side.
Over here! Quickly! They'll send more!
I saw a figure emerge from behind a rock. A man dressed in combat fatigues and a gas mask, carrying what looked like a Barrett 50 cal sniper rifle. He motioned us towards his position, and we abandoned our quad bike to follow him. Initially, I couldn't see where he was leading us, but then he opened a hidden trapdoor concealed within the ground. We followed him down the ladder into an underground bunker, slamming the door shut behind us. We were safe, for the time being at least, although our troubles were far from over. The bunker looked like it had been recently installed, but was also oddly familiar. Our savior turned on the lights to reveal a seemingly comfortable living space, although I noted the bunker was filled to the brim with weaponry. He laid down his sniper rifle and began to remove his mask. "Oh, you don't need those in here. The air is clean," the man said. Kaz and I were relieved to be able to remove our respirators and breathe normally. I'd hoped for some respite after the shock of the massacre we just escaped from, but instead I was in for the biggest shock of my life. Because when I looked up at our savior, I saw my own face staring back at me. True, the man was battle-scarred, worn out, and looked like he'd been to hell and back, but it was definitely me, my exact double. To be fair, my doppelganger was also in a state of shock, as he stared back at me with his jaw ajar. Neither of us were able to speak in that bizarre moment, so it was left to Kaz to bring some levity to the tense situation, when she exclaimed that this was certainly a first, with a laugh. And she was right, of course. We'd never seen anything like this before. This scenario had been discussed by our planners back on Earth 1, but was written off as highly unlikely. It was of course possible that another version of you would exist on an alternate version of Earth, but the chances of you running into your double during a 24-hour mission were extremely remote. And yet, it happened here, on Earth 537. "Look, I know who you are, and why you're here," said the other me, after he'd recovered from his initial shock. "The project, right? They got it up and running on your world?" Kaz frowned, looking concerned. "Well, I was recruited for it," my double replied, nodding towards me. "The same as you were, I'm guessing. I moved out of here a couple of years ago, back when the project was starting up. This bunker was part of the complex they built to accommodate us, but we didn't have enough time to construct a functioning TDP. Now I'm all that's left of that original team." There was sorrow in his eyes, in my eyes, as he looked down at the concrete floor. I couldn't begin to imagine what he'd been through. My mind was racing at this point. It seems crazy, but we hadn't anticipated this scenario where the project would also exist on an alternate Earth. But of course, this had always been a possibility. But as my double said, the project on Earth 537 had never gotten off the ground. Clearly something horrific had occurred on this world. "What the hell happened here?" I asked, part of me not wishing to know the answer. Well, my double seemed angered by the very question. "We got fucking invaded, that's what," he shouted before composing himself. "The squids are what we call them. They're an aquatic, highly evolved and technologically advanced species, originating from a water world on the far side of the galaxy, as far as we can discern. They showed up in our solar system 2 years ago and unleashed hell, attacking every nation on the planet simultaneously, wiping out cities, crushing armies. We fought back fiercely, but obviously we didn't stand a chance. It was fucking genocide." He paused briefly, wiping sweat from his brow before continuing. "I'm sorry. I haven't spoken to another human being in months. There's very few of us left now. Those drones that attacked you, they're the lower end of the squid's technology, but very effective at tracking down and killing survivors. Of course, it won't matter in another year or two. You've seen what they're doing on the surface?" I nodded my head grimly. "Yeah, terraforming," he confirmed. "We assume they're preparing the Earth for colonization. Plants and animal life are virtually extinct. The atmosphere is quickly turning toxic. In time, the hunter drones will find our remaining bunkers and holdouts, and the human race will cease to exist. On this world, at least." I shook my head, now unable to meet my double's gaze. I thought my own life had been hell, but what I'd been through was nothing compared to the suffering this alternate version of me had endured. It was a strange feeling to feel pity for a man who's also yourself, but also not you. It was a hell of a lot to process, and frankly beyond what my brain could comprehend in that moment. Kaz seemed unfazed, however, taking this bizarre new development in stride.
"We appreciate your help,"
she said, speaking to the other me.
but we're still in the shit. Our team has been wiped out and our equipment destroyed.
She glanced at her watch before continuing.
In 20 hours, our people on the other side will reopen the portal for our extraction. If we're not there, we'll be stuck here for the rest of our lives, which I'm guessing won't be very long.
My double nodded in acknowledgement, frowning in the same way I do when I was trying to think. It's possible, but it won't be easy, he eventually replied. Look, I can draw the drones away from your extraction point. Buy you some time. It will be tight and very dangerous, but if we time it well, you might just make it. I shook my head in disbelief. You would risk your life for us? I asked incredulously. The question prompted my doppelganger to smile for the first time in our conversation. Technically speaking, I'm risking my life to save me, or at least a version of me who has a chance for survival. Besides, what the hell else am I going to do? I won't survive for much longer down here. If I'm going to die, I might as well die for something meaningful. My heart sank at his poignant words. Come with us, I muttered, knowing deep down that this wasn't possible. He shook his head in the negative. I can't do that, buddy. This is my world and it's where I belong. I was born here and I'll die here. That's all there is to say. Plus, we don't know what kind of fucking shit we'll get into if I do come back and there's two of us in one place. Now, let's just get our plans straight and make our preparations. I was still in a state of shock, but Kaz spoke with my double, formulating the plan for our escape. For better or worse, we'd make our break for it at dawn. I was tempted to engage my double in conversation during that long interlude down in the bunker, to learn about his life and confirm whether it corresponded with my own. But he wasn't interested in talking with me. Instead, he fed us with canned food and suggested we get some rest. I don't know how he was able to sleep when we could all die the next morning, but I guess this has been my double's reality for some time. I did talk with Kaz throughout the long night. Oddly, in spite of everything we'd been through together, we'd never actually had a real conversation. Kaz was a good soldier, and she maintained a tough exterior, but there was a vulnerability underneath all that. We spoke about Helen and how much I missed her. As it turned out, Kaz had suffered a similar tragedy, having lost a lover during a combat mission back on Earth 1. We bonded over our mutual grief. And I'm glad that we had time to talk. It meant a lot to me, and I'm sure it did to her as well. When morning came, the tension inside the bunker was palpable. My double retained a hard demeanor as he explained his plan without emotion. I'll take the service tunnel and exit through the trapdoor a mile to the north. Once I'm in position, I'll cause a ruckus and draw the hunter drones out to my location. Once the diversion is in place, I'll radio through to you guys. After that, you're on your own. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks, I asked. Once you make the call, you need to get back to safety. There's still a chance for you and others. Sure, he replied, without much conviction. Don't worry about me. I know how to look after myself. I didn't doubt it. It surprised me that this version of me was so much braver than I was. My double wasn't one for long goodbyes. After his briefing, he put on his respirator mask, grabbed his rifle, and set off down the subterranean tunnel.
Keep your radio on,
were his parting words. I looked at Kaz before we masked up. Do you think he'll be okay?
What's the matter? Don't you trust yourself?
She said with a teasing smile. Understandably, I didn't see the funny side. We waited for what seemed like an eternity for the call, with Kaz calmly speaking into the radio when it finally came through.
We read you. Over,
she said. I'm out of the tunnel. The plan is working. I've got a half dozen drones converging on my location. I can hold them off, but not for long. You need to move quickly. Over. I angrily grabbed hold of the radio and shouted at my double. Don't be a hero. Get the hell out of there. Move it, damn you, came the furious reply. After that, all I heard was gunfire, explosions, and screaming. My blood froze as history repeated itself.
The fuckers killed him.
I screamed.
Fucking move.
Kaz ordered as she physically forced me up the ladder. With no other choice, I opened the hatch and emerged in the wasteland. We had to move quickly, not only because the drones would be hunting us, but because the portal would be opening in a matter of minutes and Earth 1 team wouldn't wait for us. We ran for our lives, across the barren landscape, struggling to breathe through our respirators. The land was cloaked in darkness, but the sun was slowly rising on the far horizon. Our extraction was at dawn, and we were quickly running out of time. We got about halfway to the hillside when I heard the ominous buzzing sound. I glanced over my shoulder in time to see a single hunter-killer drone approaching. The deadly UAV was still a distance off, but moving rapidly in our direction.
Shit.
I swore.
Keep moving.
Kaz ordered as she cast aside her rifle and backpack. I ran as quickly as I could, suddenly realizing that I didn't wish to die in this hellish place. Somehow, we reached the hillside intact, but now the drone was in range, and explosive rounds struck all around us. I saw a burst of light, indicating that the portal was being opened from the other side. For the first time, I believed we could actually make it. But the drone was right on top of us now, tearing the ground up around our feet. The portal opened, a fluid membrane leading back to our home dimension. That passageway had never looked so welcoming. I noticed the drone had stopped shooting at us, but didn't have time to consider why. Not before Kaz pushed me forwards, literally shoving me through the portal. I fell into the dark abyss, temporarily existing only in limbo, before spilling out into the metal gangway. For a second, I dared to think I was safe, but then I heard an almighty crashing sound, the awful din of metal striking metal. Instinctively, I rolled off the gangway just in time to save my life. When I turned my head, I was sickened by what I witnessed. Kaz, my long-term comrade in arms, had been crushed, with virtually every bone in her body broken. She stared at me, with fading eyes, blood pouring from her mouth as she took her last breath. I realized later that she'd sacrificed her life to save me, pushing me through the portal just seconds before impact. And on top of her broken body was the heavy frame of the killer drone. It had crossed over, following us back to Earth 1 and breaking into our underground fortress. This was a living nightmare, but it got worse. To my horror, I realized the drone was still active as the saucer hovered over Kaz's body, its weapon systems coming back to life as it scanned its new environment. The technicians and staff inside the bunker had never seen anything like this before, and they reacted with blind panic. They hardly had time to react before the drone opened fire, filling the room with deadly rounds and rockets. In a matter of seconds, the once pristine and high-tech control room was transformed into a slaughterhouse, with computer terminals, equipment, and human bodies all torn to pieces. I heard the screams and explosions and witnessed the bloody carnage, but I didn't want to join the victims. Instead, ripping off my mask and darting for the exit at the far end of the bunker, pushing my way past a couple of burly security men armed with MP5s. They bravely but foolishly opened fire on the killer drone, but predictably, they didn't last more than 2 seconds before being cut down. At least they bought me some time, allowing me to reach the bunker exit which led to the service tunnels beyond. I slammed my fist on the emergency button in a desperate attempt to close the shutter door, but it did nothing, as the mechanism had apparently been damaged by gunfire. I quickly turned and fled down the corridor in a desperate attempt to escape, By now, the whole base was on full alert, with sirens blaring and red lights flashing. Technicians and scientists ran for cover, while security troops tried in vain to stop the robot's murderous rampage. I glanced over my shoulder as I ran, horrified to see the saucer-shaped drone squeezing down the tight corridor, chasing after me while slaughtering everyone in its path. It seemed like the AI was homing in on me, fulfilling its deadly mission by hunting me down in a parallel universe. I kept running, turning a sharp corner at breakneck speed and crashing into a heavy figure running in the opposite direction. I fell, hitting the hard concrete floor and looking up to see a large soldier wearing full body armor and armed to the teeth. He screamed at me, shouting, "Get the fuck out!" But he never got the chance to finish his sentence, as a second later his head was blown clean off. I winced at the carnage, hearing the ominous din of the murderous drone scraping its way down the corridor, its weapons recalibrating as it closed in for the kill. I looked to the body of the decapitated soldier, seeing what was surely my last chance attached to his belt, a hand grenade. I reached for the explosive device with my shaking hand, grabbing it firmly and pulling the pin. In an instant, I tossed the grenade in the direction of my attacker, before tearing down the corridor and diving into cover. A couple of seconds passed before I heard the explosion, followed by the terrible whining sound of the machine slowly dying. When I eventually emerged from my hiding place, I saw the wreckage of the drone, its life force finally extinguished. I'd managed to stop the murderous machine and save my own skin, but the cost had been horrific. The Earth 537 massacre proved a watershed moment for the TDP project. The casualties on 217 and 312 had been written off as acceptable losses, but we'd lost all but one of our team members on 537, and an entity had followed us back into our own world, breaking into our previously secure base and slaughtering a dozen of our Earth-based staff. The powers that be weren't able to cover up this disaster, and before long the base was on lockdown, not to mention crawling with government inspectors and corporate lawyers. They placed an indefinite ban on new missions. As for me, my medical examination established that I wasn't dying from radiation sickness, but they did diagnose me with advanced PTSD, and I got placed on furlough pending a full psychological evaluation. Earth 537 was my final mission, and I have no intention of ever stepping through a TDP again. For a while, I considered trying to live a normal life, but how could I after all the horrors I'd witnessed? My hopes for the future had died with Helen, and the guilt I carried was too much to bear. Earth 537 had broken me, but the massacre I'd lived through had also given me a new purpose. Both my 537 double and my friend Kaz had died to save my life, so it wasn't an option to simply give up. I realized I needed to do something to atone for my part in all of this, and that's why I decided to tell my story to the world. Before I went on the run, I made a few discreet inquiries with a few of my former colleagues who still work on the project. They informed me that the ban on visiting new worlds had been made permanent, but the portal technology and infrastructure is still very much intact and operational. My former employers have identified several viable worlds, all deemed fit for colonization. They'll go ahead with their insane escape plan and their extraction plan of resources or whatever else, and think nothing of those who died to make it happen. But I remember everything. I will never forget Helen, Kaz, Custer, and all the others, and I believe their stories need to be told. What's more, we cannot ignore the threats posed by the monsters of Earths 217, 312, and 537. And God knows how many other parallel dimensions. Those evil and ruthless regimes who would think nothing of conquering our world and wiping us out. The people in charge, the government and super wealthy, they don't give a shit. If you want to survive what's coming, what I guarantee is coming, then you need to prepare. But for me, it's already too late. This will be my last entry. I know they'll get me, and I'm okay with that. I need to face the consequences of my choices. So what are my parting words? Stand and fight. Because the monsters are coming. If we can do it, so can they. And they'll show you no mercy. Godspeed, my friends.